Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm back taking another look at the adaptation of One Piece to live action and discussing the changes that were made and some of the differences that makes for the story overall. Again, not so much to offer a thought on what is better or what is worse, but what the changes mean and what we can learn from that as we try and tell our own stories. Today, we are in the aftermath of the duel with Mihawk, and I just want to say right out the bat, I discussed most of the changes to Don Krieg and Mihawk in my previous video. I don't plan to recap any of that here. So if you're interested in my thoughts on what that's done, go check out that. Although we are going to be talking a little bit more about Mihawk in our discussion of the Marines plot line. The first thing I think I need to say here is that the adaptation of Sanji's backstory and how he met Zeph is almost beat for beat identical to the manga. There's really nothing there to discuss. The importance of that story is really so key to understanding Sanji's character that I don't imagine could change much of the essential details. And the slow unraveling of Sanji being stranded on that rock almost entirely by himself with just a stranger there who eventually, of course, becomes his mentor, is well presented to build tension. Obviously, everyone's going to survive, but you have to ask how they're going to survive and how they're going to develop the dynamic that defines them to stay. The flashback, as it's structured in the manga and as it's adapted to live action, is pretty much perfect for presenting us with those questions and answering them very quickly. So I think not changing anything, especially not adding any details, is vitally important to maintaining that same strength to story beat. And credit to the Netflix writers, they recognized that and they left it pretty much as is. I think this is the area where it's most tempting to go out of your way to tinker and to improve things. And they do that in a couple of the backstories, most notably Shanks and, as we're going to discuss later on, with Nami. The Shanks backstory really just kind of expands on some of Shanks' cool moments, specifically when his crew fights with the mountain bandits, and they tinkered a little bit with the devil fruit, which I already discussed in my video on episodes 1 and 2. So I think that, they saw where they could make the changes. They saw where it was important to leave them as is. We want to have the character of Sanji that we all know and love, even if, some of the story beats he goes through are a little bit different. It's important not to change this. And again, credit to them, they left it as is. Let's talk a little bit about the Marines, because I find myself just starting with them every time, just kind of to get them out of the way. Not a whole lot happens here, and at the same time, I think this is one of the weakest episodes for the Marines. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, we have a confrontation between Mihawk and Garp that is created out of whole cloth. This has to exist because at some point, Mihawk has to explain why he's not bringing Straw Hat in. And this scene has to exist because in the previous episode, Mihawk was deliberately sent after Luffy instead of meeting him accidentally in his pursuit of Don Krieg. So you really can't not put a scene in here to answer this question. I mean, if you did, it probably wouldn't kill any of the main storyline, but it would badly undermine this Marine storyline. This also serves as an opportunity to show us Colby learning that Garp is grandfather. And this really doesn't undo anything. By the time Kobe came back into the story, he already knew that Garp was Luffy's grandfather and didn't have any problem with it. So this revelation in and of itself is an interesting story beat to add to Kobe's story, but it really doesn't change, any of the direction of where he's going to be eventually. He's not scheduled to meet Luffy again in the manga until after the events of the Water 7 saga. So having Kobe learn this fact in this way, I don't see as it really changes anything because he was going to learn it, have to come to terms with it at some point to make that story beat. That said, I don't know as this really adds a whole lot to either his character or Garp's. in the story arc as it's unfolding. We do get an opportunity for Garp and Kobe to discuss things again, and Garp makes an odd resolution. He says, "Maybe I've been going about this all wrong," and then he rallies the his Marine detachment on his ship that afternoon. And this is feels like it's supposed to be an inflection point in his storyline. It doesn't really change anything. Before this rally, we have Garp determined to track down Luffy. And after this storyline, Garp is still determined to track down Luffy. He doesn't seem to be changing his approach in any way. There may be some internal debate going on there. But since we've never really gotten a clear picture of what Garp was aiming to do before this, when he found Luffy, we can't really tell how this event might have changed it. I'll discuss more about this story arc as we get to the later episodes, specifically episode 8. But I think this is one of the weakest beats in it because it just seems to spin wheels. And that's something One Piece avoids doing in pretty much the entirety of the rest of the series. Even these marine interludes generally serve to develop one of the three main Marines in the story, Kobe, Helmeppo, or Garp. This set of scenes shows that Garp's been foiled, but we really don't get a sense of how that's going to change him or what he's going to alter as a result of that. We see him lose his temper, of course, but we've already seen that, so it doesn't add anything new. It does reinforce what we do. And while Kobe learning that Luffy is Garp's grandson is going to play into episode 7, it doesn't do anything right now. The whole thing just feels kind of lackluster. We did have to have Mihawk report in as a result of changes to the way this story arc played out, but I don't know. I think you could have done without a lot of the rest of the stuff that happened. And honestly, if you had just had Mihawk arrive on Baradier after dealing with Don Creek, maybe tracking in, he could have been there and still been challenged by Zoro. You wouldn't have had to add this level of Garp meddling in things in order to make that story work. We've also added this element where Helmeppo made it sound like the 7 warlords are covert operatives. They do things the Marines don't want tracked back to them. Now, that doesn't have to mean they're covert operatives. The 7 warlords of the sea have a great deal of autonomy in Oda's version of the story, and they can basically do whatever they want, and they don't have to say that they're doing anything on behalf of the world government. So, the Marines could issue them orders to do something, and then once they go do it, the warlords can just deny that they had any orders from the world government. But it really did sound like they were supposed to be covert, which makes Mihawk's very casual appearance in Garp's office a bit strange. You would think he would take at least a few more steps to keep his presence there hidden. Garp looked a little surprised, but we don't know if he was coming back to his office for some general purpose and just found Mihawk there, or if he was notified by an aide that Mihawk had come to see him. It does kind of sound like Mihawk just appeared there, but still, Kobe saw him. He obviously wasn't trying to keep a low profile. He was just sitting at the desk, and anyone who walked by could have seen him. So, all in all, these two ideas seem in tension, especially since Garp doesn't dress Mihawk down, and he's, at least for not being stealthy. And he's not afraid to dress Mihawk down for anything else. So, what's going on there? I don't really know. All in all, what happens in the Marine storyline in this episode is a result of a bad choice, I think, made in the previous episode, and the fact that it doesn't really develop anything. I mean, it is kind of a setup for episode 7, but beyond that, I think you could have gotten that set up a lot easier and a lot faster and not wasted as much of the runtime on this B plot, or advanced the B plot in some other way. I just think it's wasted screen time as it is right now. unfortunately. For the most part, the Marine storyline is pretty interesting and a good look at things that are happening in the world while Luffy is doing his own thing. But this episode in particular, it just feels like waste of time. Now, if you go back to Baratier, there's a lot of other good stuff going on there. I like adding Zeph to the picture to do the treatment. With Johnny and Yosaku out of the picture, I believe they did the treatment on Zoro originally. And having Zeph do it not only gives us a chance to see other aspects of his skills beyond his just being a good chef, it sets him up as an experienced captain. And it gives him an opportunity to say a line that does a bunch of things at once. Zeph is the one who tells the Straw Hats to talk to Zoro while he's out. This not only establishes that Zeph has a understanding of how to deal with injured comrades that exceeds their own, establishing him as the more experienced and wiser head in the room. He also gets an opportunity to bring up the idea that Zoro is between life and death. This is a common theme in how he's portrayed. From the moment that Kuina dies suddenly in a pure accident, we get a sense that Zoro does not hold very tightly to life. He sees, or at least he believes, that death can take him at any moment. So he has to be constantly working on his goals. That tension between having something that keeps him alive and having very little attachment to life is a theme that is often explored through his character, and Zeph gets to introduce it here. So that's very good. So the line works on not two, but a third level as well. The third level sets up Nami to foreshadow the Skypiea arc, because one of the things she does is she reads him an old bedtime story, specifically the story of Mont Blanc Nolan the Liar. That is pure fan service, admittedly, but it's very well integrated fan service that is set up by this one line that is already doing two other pretty important character bits. So there are good ways and bad ways to do fan service in any given story. In this particular instance, it's a very brilliant application of fan service and the needs of the story at the moment. I like it, and again, it shows that the writers were really in touch with most of the elements of their story and how to best push them forward. Beyond this, very simple example, we see some general examples as well. Luffy is kind of going through a crisis of what it means to be a captain here. And he has a related moment in the Baratier arc in the manga. But here, it's much more about making the call than it is about trusting his crewmates. Luffy he trusted his crewmates when Zoro went to fight Mihawk. And now he's starting to question whether he should be the one to make decisions. But he's the captain. He has to be the one to make decisions. We have several different opportunities for him to make decisions that he kind of waffles on. These are pretty small decisions, but they do kind of highlight the importance of Luffy's lack of decisive. Not that Luffy has ever lacked decisiveness before, but that he has become a little hesitant after seeing Zoro's defeat. He believed Zoro could win, been proven wrong, and he has a moment of self-doubt. That's very out of character for Luffy in the manga. Even at this moment, it wasn't so much that Luffy doubted himself as he had to try and balance the forces within himself. We'll see this again when we look at Nami's story arc in episode 7. But this is an interesting setup of the contrast. I don't know if it was deliberately set up to contrast the two characters, but it does show that the writers were setting up these elements as time goes on. And I can see where the character deviation is happening and how it's being constructed. And it's so deliberate that it's satisfying, even though it is a different structure than the one we saw in the manga. I'm going to leave that there for now because, like I said, I want to talk more about Luffy's training to contain his conflicting impulses in episode 7. That's a big part of the manga character. It seems like much less of one in the live action. Maybe part of that, the writers, and part of it is Inaki Godi and his performance. I don't know, but we're going to talk more about it as time goes on. The obvious major deviation here is the presence of Arlong and his crew on Baradier. They are not part of this story arc pretty much at all. They are foreshadowed by Johnny and Yosaku and some of their discussions with Nami in the manga, but we really don't get any sense of who they are until episode 7, or until Arlong Park begins. The events that are largely portrayed in episode 7. Obviously, we've been building towards Arlong for quite some time. He was introduced in episode 3, and we've kind of seen hints of his influence at various points along the way. But now he's really taking center stage. That's important because Arlong is the big bad of the Blue. And not only is he the big bad, he's the center of the most emotionally impactful story arc that you have to tell here. Having him introduced early gives us more of a chance to build him up. And particularly in this scene, we get a sense of who he is and what he's out for. This guy not only is the best, he wants to be the best. He wants to stand above the humans that he thinks have held him down for a long time. And in fairness, Arlong has been held down by humans for quite some time. We're going to talk more about that in episode 7 as well. Right now, we're looking at his introduction. We get a couple of very well thought out elements here. First of all, the maitre d' at Baradier is a fishman in the live action. That gives Arlong an opportunity to play against him, saying that this fishman and Arlong and his fishmen pirates are completely different kinds of people. Arlong's pirates are there to dominate. They are there to control. They are there not just to put humans in their place, but also to dominate the piracy scene. He's demanding tribute from other pirates, and we see in this episode as well that Buggy the Clown is subservient to him. I mean, yes, we got the deal between him and Buggy, but in previous episodes, but now we see that Buggy is, pretty much stuck going along with whatever they want. They've cut his head off and shoved it in a bag, which, Buggy has the chop fruit so he can survive that. And there's really nothing he can do to oppose them. And, he's a very belligerent clown. And we see more of that in episode 7 and 8 as well. He'll talk back to the Straw Hat Pirates, even when they have power over him, but he won't do it with Arlong. The difference in treatment is very stark and pronounced in this episode. This buildup not only establishes some things about Arlong we don't know about until much later, namely that he feels that fishmen have been mistreated by humans. It also establishes, a sense of his threat. We don't get the same sense of threat that we had previously. We don't see him sinking pirate ships very easily, or any of the other things that kind of built him up in the manga. And that is to his detriment. Again, we'll be talking more about that in the next episode breakdown. But all in all, this is a good start to building him up. We also get him beating Luffy in a fight. That doesn't happen in the manga. Not just because it's here. This is not something that was moved from Arlong Park to here. But rather, this is taking Luffy down a peg to push him towards the final confrontation. We already had Zoro taken down a peg by Mihawk. Now we're getting Luffy taken down a peg by Arlong. And unlike the rematch with Mihawk, we're going to see the rematch with Arlong very quickly. That's all well and good. And I understand why they did it. Many of the things that happen in Season 1 seem to have been done because the writers didn't know if they were going to get a chance to do any more of this story. This was very much a crapshoot, especially given the history of live-action adaptations on Netflix. So I understand why they just said, what all can we do? And giving Luffy a come from behind win, where he loses once to Arlong, then comes back and wins, is a very classic action movie protagonist plot point. And Luffy doesn't really have that in the East Blue. Well, some of the Don Krieg fight, you could consider him coming from behind winning, but that's been cut. So we get this opportunity for Luffy to have a come from behind win, which he really wouldn't have otherwise. That's a pretty good use of very limited time that you have to tell your story. And I understand why they made that choice. I don't think you lose a whole lot by giving Luffy his first major L here rather than against Crocodile in the Baroque Works segment. But I still feel kind of weird about it just because Arlong is not the kind of villain to just walk away from people who he feels have disrespected him. This does kind of recast a moment from the manga where Nami saves Zoro's life, or no, not Zoro, Usopp's life, excuse me, when the Arlong pirates are threatening him. And instead of stabbing herself through the hand like she does in the manga, she just stabs the Straw Hats in the back, effectively, and leaves Arlong. That's a pretty good resolution to her conflicted arc with the Straw Hats. And I think it's more believable than her faking Usopp's death in the middle of Arlong Park. Sorry about that. So all in all, I think revising that moment is a good choice as well. It just feels a little out of character for Arlong. But it does create a moment for us to bring back the Sanji scene where he swims down and saves Luffy, which is a very fun moment. And let's be honest, staging an entire underwater fight between Sanji and Kurobe would have been hellishly expensive and incredibly time consuming, probably not safe either, and I doubt it would have looked good. So all in all, taking out that entire fight sequence and just having Sanji swim down and save Luffy is a pretty good callback to the manga. All in all, I think that the changes around the Arlong pirates work, but one of the problems with them is the Arlong pirates just feel smaller. There's only a few of them here. Admittedly, seeing them, manhandle the Baratier staff and all the guests. Well, I suppose we really don't see them manhandle any guests per se. They just hold them hostage. But still, in this moment, we see that they are a force to be reckoned with, but they are not the force that they are in the manga. They are not completely altering the seabed to suit their own purposes and establish their dominance over all the humans who are restricted to the surface of the water. So it's an interesting change in fiction that kind of lowers the stakes in how big of a threat they are. They're still a big threat, but they're not as big as they were in the manga. And it also kind of pulls out one of the supporting pieces of Nami's storyline. More on that when we discuss episode 7. Adding Buggy here is fine. Again, I keep coming back to this, but Johnny and Yosaku are not in this part of the story. They need someone to help them navigate to the Konami Islands, where Coco Village is. And without those two experienced sailors to help them get around, having Buggy there to do the navigation duties and maybe advise them on a couple of other things. Again, this is a clever use of the resources the writers have. And Buggy is kind of this recurring, woebegone, kind of pathetic, all talk and very little substance villain. And having just his head there talking for several episodes really, really gets at that core of the character. So, yeah, it's fun to see that they handled that transition so smoothly. Character arc. They didn't do his mini Buggy saga. Instead, we get this arc where he's just ahead for a while, and we get that sense of transition from him to a formidable threat to kind of a pathetic guy who thinks he's more than he is, which is where he's going to have to live for quite some time until hopefully Usopp defeats him at the end of the story because that's my personal bet for where Buggy's story ends. Anyway, I like him. I think he's a very well used story resource. And while this is a place where the story is shrunk down to accommodate, the differences in scale, in this case, I think it actually serves most of the purposes of the character quite well. So I can't really complain about it too much. Actually, I kind of like it even more than Buggy's solo story in the manga. So, all in all, the changes here, they are substantial in some places, but they show the usual care and deliberate nature the writers have had so far in all respects, except the Marine storyline, which I really feel is the weakest in the entire season. Not terribly surprising that this is flimsy, but you see that they did it better in other parts and would have been nice to see that here as well. All in all, episode 6 has all of the really strong emotional beats of Baratier preserved almost shot for shot, and it has some very deftly executed changes that don't undermine those central character beats that make the One Piece is. Pretty good stuff. Let me know what you think of it down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you fit. I'll talk to you later.